Now on with the show. It is my distinct honor and great pleasure to introduce one of America's wittiest men. I dread what barbs he might hurl at us New Englanders for our temperament or our temperature today. But our laughter will make the stings bearable, I am sure. Ladies and gentlemen, I bring you the famous author and social critic, Mark Twain.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the final evening of Chautauqua here in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. You've heard from lots of folks. Tonight you'll hear from Ralph Waldo Emerson, who once said, you know, there's no such thing as history. It's all biography. All biography. And that would have satisfied most people, but not Henry David Thoreau. He said, no, Waldo, you're wrong. It's all autobiography. And the Chautauqua kind of follows that advice, reminding us that it's not history full of movements and trends, but full of people. We want to thank Robert Kilm again for his banjos, raps, and paddles. Thank you, Robert. I want to invite Debbie Waters to come up to the stage. I have something to say to her. Debbie, are you in the sound of my voice, or have you gone for the evening? Good. While she's coming, I want to recognize some other dignitaries. All those people who have read something by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Would you raise your hand so the rest of us can applaud your dignity? And if one or two of you have read something by me, will you do the same thing? Debbie, come up here. You are the biggest dignitary of the week. And the Chautauquans want to give you a little present. We found some of these sunflowers, and since you've been our sunshine all week, thank you so much. As you know, our program and theme is New England Voices, and we've been saying what they were all week. But tonight we're going to say what they're not. New England Voices are not shy. They are not effusive, not generous, not sensual, not uninformed, not self-effacing, not afraid that what they say may be wrong, not unaccustomed to leading the way, not afraid of telling the truth, not reluctant to take a stand. They're not anything but New England. Our program, as you know, is a humanities program, and the humanities work this way. They don't have any instruments, telescopes, microscopes that they can see the world with. So they use texts, books, and look at the world through the lens of those texts. And tonight you're going to look through the world, look at the world through the lens of Ralph Waldo Emerson. And afterward you can ask him some questions. Some might have to do with the quality of the lens. Ralph Waldo Emerson was born in Boston in 1803, the son of a Unitarian minister. As a Harvard undergraduate, he began a lifelong practice of keeping a journal, and it's from that journal that he wrote his poems and essays. Upon graduation, he taught school but was glad to put teaching behind him after only a few years, and he celebrated his escape in a poem called Goodbye. He soon entered Harvard Divinity School. He was approved for the Unitarian ministry in 1826, but he was glad to resign his pastorate of the Second Church of Boston in 1832. After a European tour, during which he met Carlyle, Wordsworth, Coleridge, became acquainted with transcendentalism and German idealism, Emerson turned from the pulpit to the Lyceum lecture platform. In 1835, he moved to Concord, Massachusetts, where with Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller, Bronson Alcott, and others, he propounded transcendentalism. His first book, Nature, is the basic document of his transcendental philosophy. He applied his philosophy to cultural and national problems in the American Scholar, an oration called Our Intellectual Declaration of Independence by Oliver Wendell Holmes. Among his many publications, perhaps none is more typically New England than his essay on self-reliance. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome New England's most philosophical voice, Mr. Ralph Waldo Emerson.
Thank you very much for the kind words of introduction. I must confess to you in the beginning I'm completely befuddled to be here. As you understood from the introduction, I have made my living these past years going around New England, New York, as far away as Illinois, giving lectures and speeches. And I always bring a speech which I read. And I thought I would do the same tonight. That's how I make my living. But when I spoke to the organizer of this Lyceum, Mrs. Watrous, she said, "Call me Debbie." I thought, is this New England? I've known people all over New England. I've called people by their diminutive names, members of my family and my close friends, the Alcotts, their daughter Lizzie, but never have I met a woman who presumes to say, "Call me Debbie." And so you see some of my confusion. I said, I have my speech ready. She said, they don't want to hear a speech. They don't. I've been making my living giving speeches. That's why people pay me. If I don't give a speech, will they pay me? Well, she said, they want you to say something about yourself. Oh, no, there's nothing important about myself. If you know anything about Ralph Waldo Emerson, it's that what is important is you. Well, she said, they want you to talk a little bit about yourself in a rather conversational tone. Well, what should I do? I need your advice. Perhaps we can make a bargain. You know, our New Englanders, we are famous for our bargains, are we not? After I speak, a hat will be passed around. Now, I won't give a long speech, so I don't expect you to put too much money in the hat, perhaps 10 cents from each of you. And that would give me enough money to pay my way back to Concord, Massachusetts, and pay for my lodging here. I haven't seen a bill from the hotel yet, but it shouldn't be more than $5. So 10 cents from each of you, I think that would be satisfactory and not too much of a speech. And it's a bargain, wouldn't you say? Are you in agreement? Good, good. Oh, I forgot. There have been other people speaking here the past week. Probably 10 cents is not enough. Think of all the other speeches that you've heard, all the other wonderful people. Perhaps 50 cents. 50 cents. Would that be acceptable to you? Sure. Oh, good, good. All right, then it's a bargain. It's a deal. All right. Oh, wait. I also forgot. There's a man who is supposed to follow me on this stage. His name is Mark Twain. I don't know if you know much about him. I don't know much about him. I don't understand how he came to be here, to be speaking about Voices of New England, when he is born in Missouri. But I must warn you about him. I know little about him, but I do know that during the Civil War, he was in California, in San Francisco. And when he left San Francisco, he intended to come to the East Coast, to New York. So he got on a ship and went to the Sandwich Islands. Now, I think you know a little bit about geography. It seems he was going in exactly the opposite direction. From the Sandwich Islands, he went south around the Tierra del Fuego, the tip of South America, and finally found his way north. Along the way, he wrote a story that had something to do with his trip called Captain Stormfield's Voyage to Heaven, or something. Excuse me, something of that sort. Now, it occurs to me that if Mr. Twain's geography is so bad that he probably needs much more money in order to find his way back to Connecticut. Because I suspect that the trip to Connecticut will go by way of Jerusalem. And someday you'll be hearing something about innocence abroad or some other strange tale that he will try to twist out of this affair. So if you would perhaps put $1 in the hat, I would be happy. And I certainly hope that Mr. Twain would be happy as well. My speech is small, but before I get to my speech, I want to ask all of you, do you believe in miracles? Do you believe in miracles? I saw a miracle here the other night. Daniel Webster and William Lloyd Garrison on the same platform together. Could you believe that? I thought if I'd lived to be 100 years, oh, more than that, the end of the 20th century, I would never see those two people on the same platform. Garrison and Webster. Miracles do happen, don't they? Most amazing. Garrison, I knew very well. We had many conversations. I considered him a noble man, honest and true. You could trust him to tell you the truth at any time. Webster. When I was a younger man, Webster was my hero. In 1831, after his debate with Hayne, Robert Hayne, I wrote these words about Daniel Webster. Let Webster's lofty face ever on thousands shine, a beacon set that freedom's race might gather omens from that radiant sign. What a wonderful man. And so all the more reason for me to be discouraged after Webster sold his birthright. After Webster gave away all the grand power that he had over the fugitive slave law. Now, you know something about the fugitive slave law, I'm sure. But let me give you some reminders. The problem of slavery in America is a problem created in the Constitution, which said that one part of the country would be free and the other part would be slave. This was a crime. Better that the nation should have been divided in the beginning into two separate nations than force one part of the nation to live with the sin that the other part was constantly provoking. We made a mistake in the beginning, compounded that mistake in 1820 with a new line geographically that separated slavery from freedom. And during all of this time, from time to time, slaves would escape from the South and come north, and there would be no one to capture them and return them. We in the North, if we could not avoid living in a country where there was slavery, at least had no reason to grab those slaves and send them back into slavery. It was not on our hands until the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. And there, Daniel Webster, with his hopes of becoming president, with his need to have the Southern supporters on his side, said yes to the Fugitive Slave Law. Put each one of you at task of gathering up those slaves and bringing them back into slavery. Each one of you. The crime came right into the heart of Boston. In 1852, there was an escaped slave discovered in Boston. Not only an escaped slave, the son of a congressman. We know how slavery expands. The crime was there before us. The federal marshal arrested this man. A riot nearly broke out as people tried to free him. Daniel Webster, Secretary of State from Washington, wired the news, send extra troops, make sure that this man is captured and returned to slavery. Why this crime? Because he wanted to be president. If you were here the night he spoke, you saw him as a man of principle. I see him as a man whose ambition has tarnished his principle. Many of you are good friends of Mr. Webster. He reminded us that he lived here. And so I come to you knowing that you are unhappy to hear these words, but they are true, and they should be heard. In 1854, after the death of Mr. Webster, I tried to sum up that man's life in 2 lines, in a couplet, which I hope some of the young people in the audience might memorize. And tomorrow, take to the good people of Portsmouth and ask them, is this not so? Why did all manly gifts in Webster fail? Because he wrote on nature's grandest brow for sale. I've enjoyed these past few days. I was here another day when I thought for a moment, I am in New England. This is New England after all. Louisa May Alcott was speaking, and a man asked her a question. She had been talking a little bit about slavery, and he asked her, what is the cost of freeing a slave? I thought, yes, New England, isn't it? We New Englanders, what is the cost? Calculating the worth. But it was the wrong question, wasn't it? The question should have been, what is the cost of not freeing the slave? The great moral question of our time. How do we continue to live with this crime against humanity in our nation? How long must this go on? I wrote in my journal at that time, in the 1850s, that this great crime would not leave us without a great punishment. And I saw later in 1865 that President Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, made the same kind of argument, that this war might continue until, he said, every drop of the bondsman's lash would be repaid by drops of blood on the battlefield. This great crime of ours. Mr. Webster made the wrong decision. I'm glad he did not become president. Another president, and then I will stop saying outrageous things about your state, was Mr. Pierce, Franklin Pierce. Certainly the weakest, if not the worst, of the presidents of the United States. Mr. Pierce and I were not friends, but we had a mutual friend, Nathaniel Hawthorne. Hawthorne wrote a book called From the Old House and dedicated it to Franklin Pierce, his friend, and then gave me a copy of the book, which he inscribed to me. I was so outraged. I tore out that dedication page and threw it away. How horrible to have Franklin Pierce in my household. A man has to be moral about some things. It was during this time, the time of Pierce, the time of Webster, that I wrote that ode to William Channing, that ode inscribed to William Channing, in which I said, when God made New Hampshire, he taunted the lofty land with little men. I did not mean you good citizens of New Hampshire, but rather your leaders that you have been unfortunate in having. Yes, what is the cost of freeing a slave? Those people apparently had not read my poem, Boston, in which these lines occur. Pay the ransom to the owner, and fill the sack to the brim. Who is the owner? The slave is the owner, and ever was. Pay him. There, our crime is over. So let me turn then to my speech for tonight. In 1852, while all of this agitation about the fugitive slave law was on my mind, I woke up early one night, tossing and turning, could not sleep, got up, went to my study, and wrote these words in my journal. August 1852, I waked at night and bemoaned myself because I had not thrown myself into this deplorable question of slavery, which seems to want nothing as much as a few assured voices. But then, in hours of sanity, I recover myself and say, God must govern his world and knows his way out of this pit without my desertion of my post, which has none to guard it but me. I have quite other slaves to free than those Negroes, to wit, imprisoned thoughts, far back in the brain of man, far retired in the heaven of invention, and which, important to the Republic of Man, have no watchman, or lover, or defender than I. It has been my task to try to free the slaves imprisoned in the mind, to free the slaves that society has created even in New England. Let me explain it by beginning with a fable. It is one of those ancient fables which out of an unknown antiquity convey an unlooked-for wisdom that the gods, in the beginning, divided man into men so that they might be of help to each other, just as the hand is divided into fingers to pursue its own ends. This old fable covers a doctrine ever new and sublime, that there is one man present to all particular men only partially or through one faculty, and that you must take the whole society in order to find the whole man. Man is not a farmer or a professor or an engineer, but he is all. Man is priest and scholar and statesman and producer and soldier. In the divided or social state, these functions are parceled out to individuals, each of whom aims to do his stint of the joint work, whilst each other performs his. The fable implies that the individual, to possess himself, must sometimes return from his own labor and embrace all the other laborers. But unfortunately, this original unit, this fountain of power, has been so distributed into multitudes, has been so minutely subdivided and peddled out that it is spilled into drops and cannot be gathered. The state of society in which we live is one in which the members have suffered amputation from the trunk and strut about like so many waking monsters. A good neck, a finger, a stomach, an elbow, but never a man. Man is thus metamorphosed into a thing, into many things. The planter, who is man sent out into the field to gather food, is seldom cheered by any idea of the true dignity of his ministry. He sees his bushel and his cart and nothing beyond, and sinks into the farmer instead of man on the farm. The tradesman scarcely ever gives an ideal worth to his work, but is ridden by the routine of his craft, and his soul is subject to dollars. The priest becomes a form, the attorney a statute book, the mechanic a machine, the sailor the rope of a ship. And what of God? The true God is corrupted in the same manner. The God of the cannibals is a cannibal. Is it not so? Have you not seen this? The God of the crusaders is a crusader. Yes? And so, who is the God of the merchants? A merchant. What small minds we inhabit today. Who can resist this vulgar prosperity which retrogrades ever to barbarism? As much as any men, we, New Englanders, we children of that Puritan tradition, deserve a richer, deeper relationship to God. In how many churches, by how many prophets, tell me, are you made sensible that you are an infinite soul, that the earth and heavens are passing into your mind, and that you are drinking forever the soul of God? Must we know God only as an accountant with a ledger book, continually listing our failings in one column and our successes in another? Where, instead, do we find the God who created the miracles of nature that surround us? Do we not deserve our own original relationship to God? In this age, which so desperately needs to live with that divine unity, how do we answer that question? Too many of us have been quick to answer no, and to put our faith instead in our possession of material goods. And so our real faith becomes a reliance on property, including the reliance on governments which protect it, which is the want of self-reliance. Men have looked away from themselves for so long and at things that they have come to esteem the religious, learned, and civil institutions as guards of property. And they deprecate assaults on these because they feel them to be assaults on property. They measure their esteem of each other by what each has, and not by what each is. Our dependence on these foreign goods of property that are not us leads us to our slavish respect for numbers, multitudes. The political parties meet in numerous conventions. The greater the concourse, and with each new uproar of announcement, the delegation from Essex, the Democrats from New Hampshire, the Whigs from Maine, the young patriot feels ever more the power surging in him as he is linked to numbers, as he is brought in with a great multitude, as his views seem to be their views. But is it so? Even the reformers today summon conventions and vote and resolve in multitudes. Not so, O friends, will the God who deigns to inhabit and enter you, but by a method precisely the reverse. It is only as a man puts off all foreign support and stands alone that I see him to be strong and prevail. He is weaker by every recruit to his banner. Is not a man better than a town? When we join with others, we give up of ourselves. We lose our integrity. Where then is the power in multitudes? This is the power which diminishes you, not raises you. He who knows that power is inborn, that he is weak because he has looked for good out of him and elsewhere, and so perceiving, throws himself unhesitatingly on his thought, instantly rights himself, stands in the erect position, commands his limbs, works miracles, just as a man who stands on his feet is stronger than a man who stands on his head. Men, such as they are, very naturally seek power or money. And power because it is as good as money, the spoils, so they say, of office. And why not? For they aspire to the highest, and this, in their sleepwalking, they think to be the highest. But wake them, and they shall quit the false good, and leap to the true, and leave governance to clerks and desks. Let me pause for a moment and read to you a poem, which I think in some ways brings together the things I'm trying to say. It's called Rubies. They brought me rubies from the field, they brought me rubies from the mine, and held them to the sun. I said, they look like drops of frozen wine from Eden's vats that run. I looked again. I thought them hearts from friends to friends unknown. Ties that should warm each neighboring life are locked in sparkling stone. But fire to thaw that ruddy snow, to break enchanted ice, and give love's scarlet tides to flow. When will that sun arise? When will that sun arise? Friends, the answer lies within you. Look within. Find your own genius, which holds the genius of the ages. In yourself is the law of all nature. In yourself slumbers the whole of reason. It is for you to know all. It is for you to dare all. Hitch your wagon to a star. Good citizens of New Hampshire, in conclusion, let me say to you, find that source which connects you to all mankind. For there is one central fire which flames out of the lips of Mount Etna and lightens the capes of Sicily, and now out of the mouth of Vesuvius and illuminates the towers and vineyards of Naples. There is one central light which beams out 1,000 stars, and there is one soul which animates all men. Find that light. Find that fire. Find that spark of divinity in you, which is God. Thank you. Good to see you again.
Thank you.
I hope you didn't mind my comments about you.
Not at all. Considering your geography, it was great. I noticed that Ellen, you got away without Ellen's service tonight. Someone told me that when you were introduced, you used to sit on the stage. I'm sorry I didn't invite you up, but you would shuffle your papers, rearranging them, discovering the order in which they should be presented. And Ellen thought it'd be an improvement if she stitched them together, and it was. I understand. But we'll let other people ask about the order of tonight's presentation. Can you tell me what you think about human intelligence, in case you think there is such a thing?
Perhaps we can pass that and go to more important questions.
Are there questions from Ralph Waldo Emerson this evening? Yes, who's the first?
Yes, I would like to know how your family reacted when you left the Unitarian Church and what your reasons were for doing so.
Yes, a religious person would like to know what your family thought of your abandonment of the Unitarian Church and what reasons you might possibly have had.
Why the laughter? You all know that the Unitarian Church, indeed the churches of New England for the past generation, have been pursuing dead creeds. I once attended a sermon. Outside there was a snowstorm. White sleet was falling down. Inside the minister gave forth with his passion. And which was the more real? It was the snowstorm outside. as a minister, I found that I could no longer convey to my congregation rituals and ideas which I no longer could believe. It was, in one sense, the celebration of the Lord's Supper that I found impossible to continue. What had once been an event had been made into a ritual and had lost its meaning in the process. I felt it was wrong to continue to celebrate on a weekly basis the Lord's Supper. Beyond that, the deification of Jesus began to bother me more and more. Not that Jesus was not a wonderful symbol for all of us, but when we prayed to Jesus, what were we doing? Did Jesus pray to Jesus? No. Jesus prayed to God. Jesus understood what religion was about. So I felt it necessary to be honest, to be sincere, and to leave the church. Now, I was asked, what did my family think about this? You know, as Mr. Twain said in his introduction, my father was a minister. He died when I was 8. The great influence in my family after that was his sister, Mary Moody Emerson, who wanted not only myself, but all of my brothers to become ministers. She was a wonderful lady of strange propensities. She wanted everyone to be a Calvinist except herself. And so when I left the church, Aunt Mary, of all, was the most disheartened. It took years for her to become reconciled to the fact that I was no longer a Unitarian minister.
Another question for Waldo? Yes.
I hope I'm not misquoting you when you wrote that the true ornament of a house is the friends that visit it. What did you mean?
What did you mean by saying that the true ornament of a house was the friends that visited it?
The true way of knowing a person is by the friends that he chooses. If you would know someone else, find out who that person's friends are, who he or she converses with, who he or she wants to be around. And there you know what is in the depths of the heart of that person. And so the true ornament of the house of the body is the people who come to visit and who are the friends and who illuminate us.
Yes, sir.
Who changed, you or Webster?
Webster.
Yes, please.
Don't you think that by all of this concern about our personal relationship with God and our inner selves, that can be an obsession, and then we can lose track of the rest of the community and lose track of their concerns and their needs?
Aren't you concerned that the individual with his own private God might forget the community?
Sir, if you would be true to yourself, you would find yourself in community with all men and women around the world. Trust your heart. Every heart vibrates to that iron string which is within you. Would you like me to say more?
A rather optimistic view of the damn situation.
I'm interested if Pierce shared your, well, if your relationship with Pierce was mutual. Did he dislike you as much as you disliked him?
Did Pierce return the compliments?
Mr. Pierce was a politician. He tried hard to be on good terms with everyone. His principles in life did not include morality.
Was that book that Hawthorne gave you, was that his campaign biography? Franklin Church?
No.
That was another one.
Yes. That would have been too much.
Yes.
Could you please tell me how you got along with Mr. Hawthorne?
How did you and Hawthorne get along?
Hawthorne was a very crotchety man, and one who found it difficult at times to deal with other people. He did not have a very high opinion of me. He thought I scribbled too much and did not explain things well, and sometimes he found my writing hard to understand. But I pursued him. I encouraged Hawthorne to come to Concord and live with me, and then I invited him on our afternoon walks that we did every day through the woods of Concord. There was where we learned to communicate with each other, to converse and share our feelings, and we became very good friends. At least that's the feeling from my side.
Julian once said to some friends that you invited Nathaniel to come to your house when it was convenient, and it never was convenient. Did he visit your house?
Yes, he did.
He did, huh?
Yes, he did. I'm afraid someone has exaggerated.
Yes.
Did you think that Henry David Thoreau was somewhat extreme compared to yourself?
Was Henry David Thoreau, Waldo, more extreme than you?
What was the relationship between myself and Thoreau? Thoreau was the living embodiment of my thoughts, where often I held back and remained at home in a way. Thoreau took the full importance of my thoughts and carried them out in living ability. Walden, which he went to, was on my property. Thoreau built his cabin there, you know. I gave him permission, but I'm sure had I not given him permission, he would have done it anyway. All of the farmers in the area complained about Thoreau because every day he was traveling through their farms and their woods, and they said, "You're trespassing on private property." Thoreau said, "No property is private. It all belongs to all of us." And he was not satisfied with that. From time to time, he would bring to the farmers gifts of flowers or other things which they wanted very much and were very happy to receive, not ever knowing that he had taken it from their land. Indeed, the children of Concord said, "Mr. T owns Concord."
Another question for Waldo? Yes.
Did you find with so much death in your family with the early death of your father that really influenced greatly your writing?
Did the death of your father influence your writing, Waldo?
May I rephrase that? What was the influence of the death of my father? I think it had an impact on the entire family. In my journal, at one point, I wrote, "The sons of clergymen in this generation are merchants and lawyers. There appears to have been a violent recoil from the abstinence of the previous generation. And so you see, of myself and my brothers, two became lawyers, one became a merchant. I entered divinity school and remained a minister for a brief time, but all of us left the ministry. So I think that the death of my father at an early age had a very powerful impact. Whether it was seeing our mother in poverty, or whether it was realizing that that kind of life could no longer sustain us spiritually, we all scattered away from what influence he might have had. Yes, please.
I'm curious, your writings that you have are quoting tonight are all about men. I'm wondering if your sister Mary or your friend Louisa May Alcott ever spoke to you
well, a question worthy of Margaret Fuller. You speak always about men. What about the women in your life and your writing?
It is a question I would again like to recast, and because in reality I was very sensitive to the concerns of women. I wrote in my diary in the 1850s that if women want the right to vote, they should have it. And they should own property as well. And they should have all of the things that they want. And if they did, I'm sure that my values and my goals would be more quickly achieved in the state of Massachusetts. Thank you. Very briefly, there was one moment in which I gave a lecture in Boston. And when the lecture was over, another woman turned to my wife, Lydia, who was in the audience, and said, "It must be wonderful to hear from the pulpit, from the lectern, exactly what you have been saying."
Yes.
Well, I am overawed by that circle of intelligent people that operated in Concord, Lexington. And when you go back to 75 years before you held sway there, the Lexington militia stood up without ammunition and allowed itself to be shattered by the British and stood, therefore, for liberty and freedom. And I would like to draw you away from your intellectual circle and focus you on the issue you raised, which is slavery. What did you think of the Missouri Compromise that was made about 2 years ago? Why did it not solve our problem?
Why did the Missouri Compromise not solve our problem?
I've been asked to say some more about the issue of slavery. I meant to be clear about that, but let me explain again. The problem began before the Missouri Compromise. The problem began when this nation, in its founding, accepted the notion that it would base its representation on numbers and designated slaves as 3/5 of a person to be counted for that purpose. This was a bribe which was answered by the great prosperity of this nation. And so those of us in the North could smile and excuse the crime which was existing in the South. The Compromise of 1820 simply changed the geographical line, this is all right, between North and South, between slave and free. But it did nothing to absolve that original crime. And it is because of that original crime that we continue to have our problems.
Final question for Waldo. Yes.
Your transcendentalism, is that something you evolved to, or did you have a road to Damascus evolution?
What made you a transcendentalist, Waldo?
What made me a transcendentalist? Transcendentalism is nothing really new. I explained that in my lecture on transcendentalism. Perhaps, if you like, you can read the essay that's published. The notion of transcendentalism is simply idealism. Always the world is divided between materialists and idealists. In our case, in a generation before me, or even the 75 years before me, John Locke had a profound impact on the thinking of the world by saying that everything that we could understand came through our senses. In Germany, Immanuel Kant said, that is nonsense. We have intuition. We have things which are inside us, which have never been approached by the senses, and nevertheless they are true. I believe Mr. Kant made a wonderful argument there. And that was what I was trying to say to the young people of Concord and New England, indeed, all the people of the world. Trust yourself. Look deep within yourself. There you find a being, a soul, which is connected to all the souls around the world. And when you are true to yourself, all those confusions, all those conflicts, all those competitions disappear. There is the real peace and harmony. That is why I do not agree with the reformers who take up a cause and march to the banner of that single cause. The only true reform that can be accomplished is the reform within you.
Thank you, Mr. Emerson. You're a fine New England audience. It is now time for intermission and for that contract that you made with Mr. Emerson. We're 10 cents a bushel. Chicken was 10 cents. A gallon of whiskey was 10 cents. But I have a great deal of money now, and have ever since I moved to New England. But I'm poor as a church mouse. Well, apples are $5 a bushel. $3 a bushel for peaches. $5 a bushel for Irish potatoes. A chicken is $1 or $1.50. And Scotch whiskey is $10 a gallon if you buy 2. It's more if you buy less. I don't know how much more it is. I lived for 20 years in Hartford until it got too expensive. And then I had to move to Europe for 10 years where I could afford to live. I now live in Reading, Connecticut, and I don't know how much anything costs anymore, and none of my friends do. Certainly Henry Rogers doesn't know what things cost. He took me to Bermuda not too long ago on his yacht. He didn't watch expenses at all. But that didn't mean other people weren't watching his expenses. I met a perfect stranger down there one day, came up to me and said, "You know, your friend Rogers is a fine fellow. But it's too bad that his money is tainted." Well, I said, it's worse than that. It's twice tainted. Taint yours and taint mine. Rogers is from Fairhaven, Massachusetts, a New England boy who made good. Well, like the boy in this town. Thomas Belvick Aldrich, whose grandfather's house where he was born and grew up, is just down the lane here on Jefferson Street. He made good. He wrote a book, autobiographical novel. It was the story of a bad boy. Aldrich's prose was a disgrace. And he certainly will not be remembered for anything but half a dozen poems that are as exquisite as anything in the English language. I knew him well. I would have liked to spend more time with him, but I could never get him alone. Lillian, his wife, always came along, and nobody could stand that. I was here just 1 year ago to this very day, 30th of July. And Lillian brought me up here with Howells and my friend Payne, Thomas, Albert Bigelow Payne. He came along too, to Thomas Bailey Aldrich's the dedication of his boyhood home, which his wife, his widow, had turned into a memorial and a museum. She brought us up on the train about, it must have been 60 riders. A couple of us who are satisfactorily wealthy, and then poor riders came up from New York and Boston on the train, and we were told that she had provided 2 parlor cars for her guests. Well, that bothered me. That was not typical of her. I mean, it would have been typical of almost anybody else to provide transportation for their guests. But it irritated me. And I took revenge on her. I sent Albert Bigelow Payne down to the train station to buy 2 tickets, 2.5 each round trip. I didn't want to be beholden to her advertisement of herself that way. There were elaborate invitations, engraved invitations, and a little card saying that you should go to the parlor cars for the Aldrich dedication. Payne and I went back in the parlor car after we got started. And, we're visiting with other riders. And, pretty soon, one of the conductors came along in irritating ways that conductors have, and wanted tickets. The rider showed him the invitation and the little card. And he said, well, that's an invitation, all right, and that tells you where to get on the train, but it doesn't pay the fare. My faith in that woman was restored. It was a hot, dusty trip up here. You know, the Boston and Maine Railroad does nothing but pour out ashes and cinders that get in everybody's eyes, even with all the windows closed. I don't know how they do it. We finally arrived. The governor got a ride in Ms. Aldrich's limousine from the train station to the Opera House. He gave a fine speech. He had the whole thing memorized. It was quite well done. The mayor, too, talked. He reminisced about the old times when Portsmouth was just nothing at all. And now it's just booming along. He was so proud. But it ain't booming. It's calm. Quite calm. It's sound asleep. Why she wanted to build that museum, except for advertise herself, I have no idea. I mean, the handful of people that would want to see his relic. You know, nobody would go even if it were in New York. They'd get half a dozen visitors a year. Maybe 1 or 2 more if it were in Boston. But in decayed Portsmouth, nobody will come see it. Or they wouldn't come see George Washington's relics if they were here. And finally, the poets came out and read their poetry. And nobody reads poetry poorer than a poet. And we suffered for 2 hours through manuscript reading. They would read their poems and then deposit them. I was to come last and tell about Aldrich's wit. I just threw my manuscript aside. I knew nobody wanted any more manuscripts that day. And I just engaged in about 10 or 12 minutes of absolute lawlessness. But Thomas Bailey Aldrich was always brilliant. He will be brilliant in hell. You'll see. I want to try experiments, see if I can read poetry. I always read a little poetry in my lectures. And, I had promised not to write poetry and put it in the newspaper that I was editor of in Buffalo, unless I took a dislike to the subscribers. But you must not remember that. This is a poem. It's not about Mr. Aldrich. It's about Lawrence Hutton, whose name appears in the poem. The poem is called "Last Meeting and Final Parting," and what I just said about Aldrich reminds me of this poem. I drew a little cartoon to go with the poem, but you don't need to see that. When I meet you, I shall know you. By your halo, I shall know you. Thus shall know you, blameless man. And you'll know me also, Larry, when you meet me, but may not tarry. Yes, alas, alas, you'll know me by my fan. We know that the New England voice is a poetic voice. Heard last night from a poet, Phyllis Wheatley. She read a mortuary poem, so I thought I'd dig out one of my mortuary poems and read it. I wrote it for a character in a book of mine by the name of Emmeline Grangerford. Ode to Stephen Dowling Botts, deceased. And did young Stephen sicken, and did young Stephen die, and did the sad hearts thicken, and did the mourners cry? No, such was not the fate of young Stephen Dowling Botts. Though sad hearts round him thickened, 'twas not from sickness shot. No whooping cough did rack his frame, nor measles drear with spots. Not these impaired the sacred name of Stephen Dowling Botts. Despised love struck not with woe that head of curly knots, nor stomach troubles laid him low, young Stephen Dowling Botts. Oh no. Then list with tearful eye, whilst I his fate do tell. His soul did from this cold world fly by falling down a well. They got him out and emptied him. Alas, it was too late. His spirit was gone for to sport aloft in the realms of the good and great. Life often brings troubles. And I expressed it with a little reference to my favorite game. It's called a cushion shot, a cushion first. When all your days are dark with doubt, and dying hope is at its worst, when all life's balls are scattered wide, with not a shot in sight to left or right, don't give it up. Advance your cue and shut your eyes and take the cushion first. Well, but the poetry must be serious. So I've modernized the poem. The Battle Hymn of the Republic brought down to date. Mine eyes have seen the orgy of the launching of the sword. He is searching out the hoardings where the stranger's wealth is stored. He hath loosed his fateful lightnings, and with woe and death has scored. His lust is marching on. I have seen him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded him an altar in the eastern dews and damps. I have read his doomful mission by the dim and flaring lamps. His night is marching on. I have read his banded gospel writ with burnished rows of steel. As ye deal with my pretensions, so with you my wrath shall deal. Let the faithless son of freedom crush the patriot with his heel. Lo, greed is marching on. We have legalized the strumpet and are guarding her retreat. Greed is seeking out commercial souls before his judgment seat. Oh, be swift, ye clods, to answer him. Be jubilant, my feet. Our God is marching on. In a sordid slime harmonious, greed was born in yonder ditch, with a longing in his bosom, and for others' goods an itch. As Christ died to make men holy, let men die to make us rich. Our God is marching on. Well, the New England voice is not only poetic, it is also, as we heard last night from Abigail Adams, political. I have always counseled honest men to go into politics, adding my New England political voice, because there their honesty will shine more than it will in any other field. But you know, these days, it is so hard to find politicians of sufficiently high morals that they will stay bought. But we're fortunate in this country. We have legislators that are as expensive as any in the world. And we can be thankful that in our country we have no native criminal class apart from Congress. You know, God made idiots, but that was just for practice. And then he made Congress. A few years ago, I introduced a young Winston Churchill to an audience at the Waldorf Astoria in New York City, and I quarreled with him. We are kin to Englishmen. I don't care what Abigail said last night. We are kin. And now we are kin with them in sin. They forced themselves into South Africa in that war. It wasn't necessary at all. And now we've done the same thing in the Philippines. You know, patriots, Filipino patriots, had been fighting for years. And when Admiral Dewey went and exterminated the Spanish fleet, should have turned the Philippines over to the patriots. But then someone here thought up the divinely humorous scheme of buying the Philippines. for $20 million. Of course, not from the Filipinos, but from the Spanish, whose title to it Dewey had already extinguished. People don't understand our policy, and they must be made to understand our policy. We can do no wrong. It's true. We have betrayed a friend and a poor and helpless people, but it was necessary. It was necessary in order to bring civilization and morals to a people that hadn't any. And we can make up for it. We can give them a new flag. Well, it'll be our own flag, with the white stripes painted black, and the stars replaced by a skull and crossbones. They will understand. Well, the New England voice sometimes let folks out. We heard on the first evening Daniel Webster and William Lloyd Garrison talking mostly about slavery, about Negro folk, and last night the poet Phyllis Wheatley said she had heard herself being talked about in the third person, and that was so. But I began as an author by trying to give a first-person voice to one who lived in these parts, but was born down south. She was our cook, and a colored woman. It was her story that Howells first printed of mine in the Atlantic Monthly magazine. You know, Howells don't pay worth a rap, but it's a powerfully respectable magazine. They don't expect the humorist to stand on his head and paint himself striped there for 15 minutes. Okay. I called it a true story, repeated word for word as I heard it. It was summertime and twilight. We were sitting on the steps of the farmhouse, on the porch really, but Aunt Rachel, our cook, colored woman, was sitting respectfully on the steps below. She was a strong, hearty woman, and it was no more trouble for her to laugh than it is for a bird to sing. She was being teased this evening and enjoying it immensely and just quaking with laughter. And finally she was holding her face in her hand, just shaken with enjoyment. But when I asked her, I said, Rachel, how is it you have lived 60 years and never seen any trouble? Well, she stopped quaking. She looked up at me and said, Mr. Clemens, is y'all in earnest? Why, yes, I said, I've never heard you so much as sigh. Has I had any trouble? Mr. Clemens, I was going to tell you, and then I leaves it to you. I was born down among the slaves. I've been one myself. I was born in old Virginia, but my mother was born in Maryland, and my man, she was something. When she get into it, she make the fur fly. She put her hands on her hips, and she'd say, looky here, I want y'all to understand that I weren't born in the mash to be fooled by trash. I was one of the blue hens chickens I ate. Well, she say that word often. So I uses it sometimes myself. She said at one time when my littlest boy, Henry, me and my old man, that's my husband, we had 7 children. We loved them children. just as y'all loves your children. They's black, but the Lord can't make no children so black but what their mother loves. Well, my littlest one, Henry, was running one day and fell and bust his head open and tore his wrist back. And when the niggers didn't run around fast enough and do what she told them, she put her hands on her hips and she said, "Look here, I want y'all to understand that I weren't born in the mash to be fooled by trash. I was one of the blue hen's chickens, I is." And then she bandaged up that child herself. So I says that words to him. Well, by me by, the years go on. And my old missus come to me one day. She said, "We're broke. Got to sell all you niggers on the place." Oh, I know what that means. And now Rachel had come and was standing on the porch above us, black against the sky. They put chains on us, stand us on the porch. They walk all around, one come up and pinch and say, "This one don't amount to much. This one's too old." They sold my old man. When they began to sell my children, I cried. And the man, he hit me on the mouth and said, "Hush up your damn blubber." When they sold all my children except little as Henry, I grabbed him up close to my breast and I said, "I'll kill the man that touches him." Henry whispered in my ear, he said, "I was going to run away and I'll buy your freedom." Bless the child. But they took him from me. The man that bought me took me to New Bern. By and by, the years roll on, and the war come. Master was a Confederate colonel. I was the family cook. When the Unions come and took the town, they used Master's house for the headquarters. And the general, he come into my kitchen and he asked me, would I please cook for them? "Well, bless you," says I. "That's what I was called, sure." He said, "Now, don't you take anything from anybody. You just make them walk chalk in your kitchen." "You're among friends now," that's what he told me. "You're among friends." So I cooked for the gentleman. One day, when the officers was in the parlor pouring over their map, I went in and I dropped a kerchief. And I asked the gentleman, since they be from the north, if they ever see my little Henry with a scar on his head and another on his wrist. The gentleman said, "How long ago since you lost him?" "Oh," I said, 13 years. He said, "He won't be little anymore." He said, "He'd be grown, he'd be a man." I never thought of it. He was always little Henry to me, yes. He had run away. He went north. He worked for himself. He was a barber. And when the war come, he said, "I'm done with barber. I was going to find my old mammy." So he hires himself out to a Union colonel and scours the South. But I didn't know nothing about this. Well, the gentlemen hadn't seen him and they couldn't do nothing for him. Then, one Saturday night, there comes a whole platoon from a Negro regiment that was on guard duty at the house. They come into my kitchen. And they bring a band, and they was putting on airs. They was having a time, and I was just swelling up. And one dancing around me with a yaller wench, making fun of my big old red turban. And I said, "Go along with you rubbish." Well, that made him worse. And it made me worse, too. So I put my hands on my hips, and I said, "Look here, I wasn't born in the mash to be fooled by trash. I was one of the blue hen's chickens, I is, and I marched them soldiers out of my kitchen like I was a general myself." That was about 1 o'clock in the morning. I see that man looking back in the door like he's trying to remember something. But at 7 o'clock, I was up getting the officers' breakfast, and I had just stooped down, opened the stove door to get the pan of hot biscuits out of the stove, and I see this black face coming around the stovepipe, and his eyes are looking into mine. And my hand began to tremble, and all of a sudden I know the pan fell on the floor, and I went for his sleeve and pushed it back, and pushed back his hair and said, "Boy, if you ain't my Henry, what you doing with that tear on your wrist and that other one on your forehead?" Oh, the Lord God of heaven be praised, I got my own again. Oh, no, Mr. Clemens, I ain't had no trouble and no joy. Well, I sent Aunt Rachel's story off to Howells. I said he could pay as lightly as he wanted for it because it was out of my line. There was no humor in the story at all. Well, he published it. He and asked for more. And I sent him Life on the Mississippi. Pretty soon comes along Huckleberry Finn. And first thing I know, I was an author. And once in England, I was called a great author. But I was disappointed to have my name in the list of the great authors. Because, you know, they have a habit of dying off. Well, Chaucer's dead, Spencer's dead, so's Milton, so's Shakespeare. I'm not feeling this too well myself. Thank you. Feeling a little unwell. I'm not unwell enough not to be able to entertain your questions. I won't answer them, but I will entertain them. Speak up if I don't see you, yes.
Is there any part of the character of Tom Sawyer or Huckleberry Finn that actually came from your own boyhood?
You haven't read them. This is the way Tom Sawyer begins, with a preface. Most of the adventures recorded in this book really occurred. One or two were experiences of mine. The rest are those of boys who were schoolmates of mine. Huck Finn is drawn from life. Tom Sawyer also, but not from an individual. He's a combination of characteristics of three boys whom I knew, and therefore belongs to the composite order of architecture. Yeah. Yeah. The answer is yes. That's the short answer. Boys that I knew. Yes?
No, I was going to say there's somebody over there looking for...
Well, ask your own question. Yeah.
Swain, ask a question. Being a vet man, you think the United States of America is an experiment that is going to survive or will fail in the long term?
Will the United States survive, or will it fail? The question is, will the human race survive, or will it fail, the damned human race? Someone asked me one time if I was an American, and I said no. I am the American. Of course, we will survive if we have the true patriotism. That is to say, loyalty to the country all the time, and to politicians when they deserve it. and also to the other institutions of the country. You know, in Austria, people take their religion from the monarchy, and their patriotism too. In this country, we take our patriotism from the newspaper and from politicians. And newspaper and politician-made patriotism is just in the troughs. But I don't think there's a man in the country, maybe two or three, who get their opinions on politics or morals or religion from anywhere but their neighbors. What we need in this country is for people to go off and hammer out their own opinions in the privacy of their own home. We don't have to take our politics from politicians and from the newspapers the way the Austrians take their religion from the king. We don't. But we do. We do know and a feeling in this country, a thinking, and a feeling, and count it as thinking. But it isn't. It is merely public opinion. There's some people that think it settles everything. Some think it's the will of God. But as a black preacher once told me, he said, it's only corn pone. He said, you tell me where a man gets his corn pone, and I'll tell you what his opinions are. A man can't afford to have opinions that are different from those of his neighbor without interfering with his business or his social life. And so when I think like that, I kind of talk myself out of my first opinion. Yes.
I think you've made some comments about the weather when you were living in Hartford, Connecticut. Yeah. And I believe the number is you counted 124 changes in the weather or something like that.
Just in the springtime.
Could you expound upon how you got to such a large number and how
Well, I met a gentleman who was going to go around the world. He's going to set up a museum, I guess, like Ms. Aldridge. A weather museum. And he was going to set out and go all around the world collecting all the different weather that he couldn't put it in his museum. And I said, don't you do it. You just go up to New England, spend a day in the spring up there, and you can find it all. And he did. It was very successful. You know, God made all of us. But who makes the weather in New England? Nobody knows. I think it's a young apprentice in the weather office. He practices on New England, and when he gets it right, then he goes promoted somewhere else, and he's replaced by another apprentice. But you know, the best part of the New England weather is the ice storm. When it comes and coats every branch of the bare tree with the most pure crystal. And then in the morning when the sun comes out and hits that and turns it ablaze, it makes you just thrilled. And want to forget everything that you said nasty about New England weather.
Over here.
Over here, yes.
I understand you're quite a technophile and you own one of these newfangled typewriter things. Are there other gadgets that you think might have a future?
I don't own a typewriter. I did own a typewriter. The first author to submit a typewritten manuscript to the publisher. But it was a cantankerous machine, and it degenerated my morals somewhat. So I gave it to William Dean Howells, my friend. My morals came back up just like that, and his went down. I hope we don't have any more inventions like the typewriter. You know, a man, let me get this right now, a man by the name of Alexander Alexander Graham Bell came to my home one day selling something he called a telephone, selling investment in a telephone. I have made so many bad investments in my life that I have invented the rule that one ought never invest when one hasn't the money. Nor when one has the money. But I wasn't going to invent in some foolish machine like that. That will never amount to anything. No, I put all my investment, all Libby's investment, into the Page typesetting machine. And lost it all. Yes?
I understand your brother Orrin has helped you control your wealth as well.
You're not a friend of the family. Well, I mean, I know that because his name is Orion. Some people mispronounce it as Orion, but it's not. Orion. No, he was my much older brother, and he tried to play father to me, but I resented it. He never was able to hold on to money, and had little advice for me. I was able to find him a job until his principals interfered with it. His principals were always getting in the way. He ran on the temperance, the anti-temperance platform until the night before the election, and he became a temperance man. Orion had bad luck. Yes?
You were friends or acquaintances with many well-known people of your day. Could you tell us a little bit about your friendship with Ulysses Grant?
Yes, the general and I got to be friends. We were acquaintances, of course, but I almost met him before the Civil War. No, I mean, when I was in a band of Confederate irregulars, we got the intelligence that Ulysses S. Grant was coming our way with a whole regiment at his heels. And those were in the days when you could say, Ulysses who? Nobody knew him or me. But I declined invitation to meet him and began to move in the same direction that he was moving. And after 2 weeks of retreating, I went to the captain and told him that I'd become disappointed in the war. And so I withdrew and thereby crippled the Southern cause. But of course, after his presidency, I was on the street one night, and I heard some people talking about the general's memoirs and who was going to publish them. Well, the next day I looked up the general and said, "Don't you sell your memoirs for that. They were going to pay him $10,000 for it." Well, he had almost promised the publisher that he would, but I offered him 10 times that and more. Well, he consulted around. Finally did write the memoirs, published them. Well, he finished them about 2 weeks before he died. And I was able to write his widow the largest royalty check ever written by an American publisher. My publishing house, the Webster Publishing House. They published those two volumes. I wrote a check for $250,000. I took all the money that I made and invested it in another book. The life of Pope Leo, the authorized life of Pope Leo XIII. I thought every Catholic in the world would want that. And I've concluded that Catholics don't read. Yes. Well, what a wonderful, wonderful woman. Sweet woman, a courageous woman. I admired what she had overcome, if all of us. could meet the challenges of life the way she has, with so many multiple handicaps, well, the world would be, well, it wouldn't be the world at all. Yes?
Mr. Clement, why the pen name Mark Twain?
Why the pen name? Well, it's more a nom de guerre. It stands for two fathoms. You know, and when they're singing out on the measuring the depth of the river, half Twain, quarter Twain, when they reach Mark Twain, that's 12 feet. You can take a boat through safely there. That's safe water. At least it's safe water if the numbers are going up. If the numbers are going down through Mark Twain, then you're in trouble. And I've always been fascinated by twins, by those of us who are twain. I think every man is a moon and has a dark side that he doesn't show to the world. It belonged to Isaiah Sellers. He used to write for the New Orleans paper. He was an old steamboat man. And he wrote under the name Mark Twain. It was just technical things about the depth of the river and that kind of thing. The same moving sandbars and so on. But once in a while he'd branch out and try some literature. And I made fun of one of those literary columns. And he quit writing. So later on, when I was out in Nevada and had failed at prospecting, I wrote for the newspaper and I needed a nom de guerre, and I kind of in tribute to him, I used the name Mark Twain. And it's not true what you heard, that it comes from my going in so many saloons and saying Mark Twain, put me down for 2 drinks. That's not how I got that name. I chose it myself. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to put this lawlessness to rest. And I want to thank you. I'm George Frine, retired from the University of North Dakota. This is Dick Johnson, who portrayed so well earlier this evening Ralph Waldo Emerson. Like Dan Lewis, he teaches history at California State Polytechnic University in Pomona, California. He returns to Portsmouth for the 4th time. You've been here every year, doing John Dos Passos, Abraham Lincoln, and Alexis de Tocqueville. Just a walking history book with all those characters. But we have a time for a little bit of conversation out of character in which you can ask questions of us about what we did and about the characters, and might get a true response to your answer instead of a lie. Any questions for Dick or for me? Yes. You're asking this of Dick. How do you keep straight? I have a wife. I mean, I don't know.
When you asked that, I thought of one of my favorite stories that Mark Twain tells about being sick on the train going to San Francisco and wondering what he could do to heal himself. And he said that one woman recommended a quart of whiskey. A man recommended the same thing. Well, he said that made half a gallon. I thought that would be his answer. It's a good question, and one for all of us. I just so thoroughly enjoy this. Gives me an opportunity to do a kind of research I never would have a chance to do anywhere else. To not only learn about what someone has said, but in a sense, to go into their living room and their parlor and their bedroom and find out as much as I can about them, so that at some point I begin to think, I really know this person. And then maybe, well, actually today it was all day, but often for half an hour or an hour before going on stage, you just sort of try to center yourself into that person and hope that it works.
There's also a little bit of a trick to reading so that you can say things first person instead of third. And at least I find myself reading a little more carefully, being a little more faithful to the text than I might otherwise. Anyway.
What do you do when you get a question you can't answer when you're in church?
What do you do when you get a question you can't answer? What I do is quote Twain. My memory's not what it used to be. The time was I could remember everything that happened and everything that didn't happen. And now I can only remember the latter. When I found that sentence, I typed it up, put it on the wall.
It's, I think of the question and answer period sort of like preparing for qualifying exams, or it often makes me remember John Kennedy talking about his press interviews, where he would, try and get ready, and I think for the most part, you get to the point where you can answer just about any question that comes along. Although tonight there was a lady who came up to me after my presentation and whispered in my ear, by the way, did you and Henry David Thoreau make it to the Isle of Shoals? I have no idea. It was so nice of her not to ask that question.
Well, of course, we've all been to college, and in college, on the examination, you've got to put down an answer, if not to the question asked, to another one. Maybe they won't know it. Yes.
Have you did this outside of this country, and if so, what was the reaction?
I missed the first part.
Have you put this kind of presentation outside of this country? And
No,
so what was the reaction?
no, we haven't, and I don't know anybody who has, but I do have a story. In the old Chautauquas, that were commercial enterprises, they went to Australia one time. A lot of temperance was preached in the Chautauqua, and that didn't go over very good in Australia. And they were worried about it, but they sent out young college girls to deal with the businessmen who were going to buy the tickets and then sell them and try to recoup and bring Chautauqua. And they were just so charmed with these young ladies and their strange English pronunciation that they didn't read the small print. And then when they got together later, one asked the other, did you sign on for that she got you too? So the modern humanities Chautauqua has stayed home. I don't know, would the Humanities Council in New Hampshire be willing to send us up into Canada? Or even Vermont or Maine? Yes?
Do you do it in other parts of the country, and if so, are there regional differences in spots?
Are there regional differences in the country that you've observed on Chautauqua, having done it elsewhere?
Oh, well, that's a question you can answer as well or better than I. Yes, I think there are differences, but often they are differences of generations or different people. It's a little harder to identify regional differences. When preparing for this place, Portsmouth, I was very worried about the fact that I did not have a New England accent. And then I thought about, well, does Debbie Watrous have a New England accent? It's like half the people that I've met in Portsmouth come from somewhere else anyway, so I think let's not worry about it.
I was delighted to come to Portsmouth because I had some wonderful stories about Portsmouth and was able to say hostile things about the town, and you laugh. You're wonderful. Yes.
Have either of you considered another character? Would you do that kind of research and do another character, or have you?
You've done 4 characters. Would you do another?
Yes, I would. And then you've done...
I've done 4, and I won't. You must understand that there are about 30 volumes, 29 volumes in the Oxford Mark Twain, just recently published of all his first editions, first print American printings. Then his letters are 5 volumes, up to 1874, and he lives to 1910. He has diaries, he has journals, he has autobiographical dictations that have been 3 times published, and there's still about a third of them yet to be published. He spent one summer here in New Hampshire dictating his autobiography. So there's just an enormous amount of it. And I'd rather dig into this than go on to something else.
Was there a connection between Mark Twain and York, Maine?
York, Maine. Yes.
Which is across the bridge.
He vacationed in Maine in something like 1906 or something like that. Or it was 5 and 6 in New Hampshire. But I don't know the details of it. If I were invited to Maine, I would.
York, Maine is very proud of the Mark Twain.
Is it? Of the connection? Yes.
I know, I hear of it.
Uh-huh.
I've just never investigated it.
Well, he wasn't so proud of it that it appeared prominently. Yes, please.
Just the both of you, for a youth who's thinking on careers, how did you choose
A youth who is thinking
on what career?
about a career, yes.
So how did you choose such a unique profession?
Well, I was a professor of religion studies. 9 months out of the year, I had to think about religion. And then I picked Henry Adams, Herman Melville, and Mark Twain, 3 of the most irreligious 19th century figures, for an intellectual vacation. You teach history, and you do history in Chicago.
Yes, at this time there are very few people who do this as a profession and get paid enough to survive. I knew nothing about Chautauqua until about 7 years ago. I got a phone call one night asking if I would audition to be Alexis de Tocqueville. Sounded like a wonderful opportunity to me, and we've been trying things ever since.
Yes?
Who else would you like to do?
Who else would I like to do? My goodness. Who else would I like to do? At this point, I'm sort of waiting for opportunities to come up. I'll tell you quite frankly, I wasn't too eager to do Emerson. I find him, of the 4 characters that I have done, the most difficult. There are layers of secrecy about him. Publicly, he invites everyone to be liberated and free and celebrate their connection to each other. He's a very private individual. His relationship with his wife, there's a lot of distance between them. And I had a lot of trouble with him. So I just haven't thought of your question. That's one I can't answer right now.
Thank you.
Yes, sir?
When you come back next year, both of you.
It depends on those evaluations. Have you looked in the hats? We looked in the hat. No, we haven't. We will decide later on. You are a lawless audience. I mean, we can't take you seriously.
You seem to fall really easily into the character of Mark Twain. It seems like your own personality and his personality are merging.
It was more it's difficult for me to be other characters than Twain. It seems like I fell instead of getting pushed, which is what happened. But Herman Melville was not easy because I had never been to sea. I mean, I've never been out on the ocean. I'm a little terrified of what I'm just whale watching out here. But of course, it's wonderful philosophical and theological material. It's really great stuff, and I did it at his home in Pittsfield last summer, where he wrote Moby Dick. In the beginning, I talked about going to sit right before on the forecastle deck. Some very nice gentleman came up afterwards and said it's forecastle. That's spelled it, right? But I grew up in the Midwest. What did I know? There's always a different challenge for every character. You have been a wonderful audience all week long. There's just one more event this evening. I'd like to invite the other scholars to come up to participate in this. We wish to bid you adieu and thank you for your attention and your delightful presence night after night. I should remind you to fold up your chair and stack it against one of the side poles. If you're next to a frail neighbor, you might help that person. Let the person get out of the chair before you get there. We want to bid you goodbye and to suggest that you can go to Chautauqua tomorrow night or any night during the winter without ever leaving Portsmouth. All that's required is you go to the library or the bookstore and get a book. Tell the kids they got to do the dishes and go in and sit down and read the book and give yourself a Chautauqua. So I've asked each of the teachers here to bid you farewell by suggesting a book that they think you might like to read, and in the category of biography or autobiography. Doug, what would you recommend?
Well,
is this on? Can this be on?
You can pass it on.
It's on.
You can hear it anyway. The one that's back there is the brand new biography of Garrison by Myers. My mind has gone blank, but Awe on Fire, which is really the best biography ever done on Garrison. There hasn't been one in about 30 years, so it's really an excellent piece of work. And uses lots of undiscovered material. So that's one I would recommend if you're looking at Garrison.
Good. Dan?
Ah, yes. Forgot how tall Doug was. The biography by Remeni, which is in the bibliography of the material that I hope you keep, and I hope you look through all those essays that were written that the Humanities Council worked very hard to put together. It's really thick. It's very good, but I don't think any of you would want to challenge such a thing, but do consider it. I think Daniel Webster would like you to look at the Farewell Address by George Washington. That's a little bit shorter.
Very good. Dorothy?
It's been fun. Thank you so much for having me. I'd like to recommend, it's really not an autobiography, but I'd like for you to perhaps read, it's called Black Yankees. Black Yankees by Pearson, P-I-E-R-S-E-N. I think it will really open your eyes to the colonial period and where black people were and what they were doing at that time.
Thank you.
The book I've just put down a couple of weeks ago is called Tuesdays with Maury. And I guess some of you have been recommending it to others already. So those of you who don't know it, you heard the applause. Pick it up and read it. Tuesdays with Maury.
In Linda Meyer's honor, I will recommend a book for her, one that Abigail Adams, of course, knew nothing about, but it is the finest autobiography ever written by an American, The Education of Henry Adams. fourth generation Adams, her great grandson. He writes